All right, today we will be talking about the American Revolutionary War. So it'll be a lot in one day because we're going to do an entire war. So bear with me. Your objective for today is to summarize key milestones during the Revolutionary War. So this is an extension on our last lesson of the Declaration of Independence. So if we go back to our timeline, the Declaration of Independence is like our first big event in the war, even though it's not a battle. We move on to the rest of the battles and the events in the Revolutionary War. This is a standard. Scholars don't tend to super exceed in. About 56% is the amount of times this question is answered correctly on STAR. My goal for our class is 70%. Key point one. The war begins with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, known as the shot heard round the world. The two sides of the war are the British soldiers and the colonial Minutemen. So the war begins with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and this is known as the shot heard round the world. So there are two sides to this war. The British soldiers, who are often, actually always, dressed in red, and the colonial Minutemen, who are eventually dressed in blue. So let's take a look at the colonial Minutemen in the British Army. You might notice some differences right away. One major difference, the colonial Minutemen were a militia, and I'll talk about that in a second. The British Army is the opposite. They all have matching uniforms, they have nicer weapons, they look a little bit more prepared and orderly. The colonial Minutemen are really just like a disorganized militia. So a militia is like an informal army. It's like a group of people who have gotten together to fight, but they don't like really have any training. They don't have all the same types of weapons. They don't have matching uniforms. So the colonial Minutemen are an army, but they're like not highly trained. They don't have a lot of supplies. They're kind of like a makeshift like group of ragamuffins, like the island of misfit toys. So the war officially begins with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So this battle took place in Massachusetts. Um, it is known as the shot heard round the world. And what they mean by the shot heard round the world was it was like the official beginning to the Revolutionary War. So the first gunshot fired was famous because it kicked off and initiated the Revolutionary War. During the battles of Lexington and Concord, 73 British soldiers had been killed, 174 were wounded, and 26 were missing and presumed dead. So it was a pretty violent battle, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. First, MRS. Why is the Battle of Lexington and Concord significant? It was the first battle won by the French. It was the first battle won by the colonists. It was the first battle of the Revolutionary War. Go ahead and pause the video and answer this question. I'm going to give you a few seconds to pause it and answer it. Great. The correct answer is this purple boxed one. It was the first battle of the Revolutionary War, known as the shot heard round the world. That is Lexington and Concord. Next, MRS. What are the two sides of the Revolutionary War? We know we have the colonial Minutemen and the British soldiers, but which is which? Think about that color coding I talked to you about earlier. Go ahead and pause the video and answer this question. Great. So the colonial Minutemen is on the left. The British soldier is on the right. You can tell by the colors they wear. So the British soldiers wore red. Colonial Minutemen wore dark blue or navy blue. Key point 2. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world, next is the Battle of Saratoga, a turning point of the war with a victory for the Patriots, for the colonists. It helped to convince France to ally or team up with the American forces against Great Britain. Let's break this down a little bit. The Battle of Saratoga was a battle in New York State. Okay, so that red shaded area, that is Saratoga, and that is where this battle took place. You'll note that most of the battles in the Revolutionary War took place in the northern colonies. The colonists won the Battle of Saratoga. The colonists won the Battle of Saratoga. Once the French saw that the colonists won, they decided they would ally or team up with the colonists, which leads us to the question, why would France ally with the colonists? Why would France fight with the colonists against Great Britain? The short answer being, France wants revenge on Great Britain after losing the French and Indian War. So if you remember, back in 1763, Great Britain defeats France in the French and Indian War. Great Britain won over France, and that meant Great Britain won some land in the New World. France was like a little embarrassed they lost the war, and they decided that they would team up with with the colonists to defeat Great Britain. Look at this phrase in red at the bottom of your screen. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is a really famous phrase. It also explains why the French allied with the colonies. Because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So because France is enemies with Great Britain and Great Britain's enemies is the colonists, France's enemy is the enemy of the colonists. It's a little confusing, you get it. So this, after the Battle of Saratoga, French allies with the colonists. They are now working together. So if you remember our discussion about Marquis de Lafayette, the Frenchman who fought with the colonists against Great Britain, he participated after the Battle of Saratoga, after the French allied with the colonists. So who won the Battle of Saratoga? Was it the British or the colonists/patriots? Go ahead and pause the video and select your response. Who won the Battle of Saratoga? All right, the correct answer for this one is the colonists or the patriots. That is why it is considered a turning point in the war, because finally the colonists, the patriots, are starting to win some battles. Before, they're just getting defeated over and over again. What caused France to ally with the colonists? Go ahead and pause the video to select your response. So what caused France to ally with the colonists? Remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So because France was defeated by Great Britain, they basically just wanted to get revenge on Great Britain. So they worked with the colonists to defeat them. Key point 3. After that is the Battle of Yorktown. The British surrendered after two of their generals were captured, one of them being Lord Cornwallis. So the Battle of Yorktown, you don't have to memorize this little visual on the right. Just know the Battle of Yorktown is really important because the British surrendered. Surrendered means you give up, right? If you surrender, you're like, I can't fight anymore. The other side wins. So a little throwback for us. Who is this? Try to remember, look at some anchor charts. Who is this? If you answered James Armistead Lafayette, you are correct. You might remember he's the man who pretended to be a runaway slave in the Revolutionary War to get information from the British for the colonists that helped them win the Battle of Yorktown. So James Armistead, there he is again, he is part of the reason the colonists won this battle because he gathered some secret information while spying on the British that he gave to the colonists, which allowed the colonists to win that battle. Another major reason the colonists won that battle was because they captured Lord Cornwallis. So this is Lord Cornwallis. He was a British general or a British lord. He was captured by the colonists, and that forced the British to surrender. So once one of the most valuable and knowledgeable people on the British side was captured, the British realized they couldn't go on without him, which forced them to surrender. In which battle did the colonists capture Lord Cornwallis? Go ahead and pause the video and select your response. All right, the correct answer is the Battle of Yorktown. So in this system, in this question, Lord Cornwallis was captured in the Battle of Yorktown. The Battle of Saratoga was the turning point in the war where the colonists won. So what is the score so far? We have talked about 3 battles. What is the score? You may be saying, well, how do I know who's home and who's guest? Let's remember this war is taking place in the 13 colonies, like in New York and Massachusetts, in Connecticut, right? And who is kind of visiting on this land for the war? Go ahead and pause the video now to select your response. All right, your screen should look like this. Home is the colonists because the war is happening on their home turf and they have a score of 2. They have won 2 battles. Guest is 1 because the British have won the shot heard around the world, Lexington and Concord. Key point 4. During the winter at Valley Forge, after losing a lot of battles, Washington took his army to Valley Forge in the winter of 1777. Valley Forge is a really famous time in the Revolutionary War period. So George Washington, in this winter of 1777 to 1778, takes his disorganized militia to Valley Forge. The winter was harsh, and men suffered from starvation and frostbite. So they didn't have enough food. So a lot of the men in Washington's army simply died because they didn't have food. A lot of men also were at least injured by frostbite. If you don't know what frostbite is, it is when you are in cold temperatures for too long and your body can't stand it. So parts of your body quite literally freeze, and it's very, very painful. It's excruciatingly painful. It usually happens to like your limbs, like your feet or your fingers, and they will freeze. And then once they have frostbite, it's usually you can't use them anymore. So if your feet get frostbite, you can't keep up walking with the rest of the militia. So winter at Valley Forge was a really tough time for George Washington and his army. I also mentioned to you earlier in this lesson that Washington's army was a disorganized militia, that they were a group of people who were kind of thrown together for the cause. They didn't have a lot of training or supplies or a lot of knowledge about like military tactics. But over that winter in Valley Forge, although winter at Valley Forge was tough, it was when Washington's men went from a disorganized militia to an actual prepared army. So during this winter at Valley Forge, Washington's army really has a glow up, right? They go from kind of being like this group of like scraggly men who are like, okay, well, I have this weapon and I think I have a winter coat, to like having uniforms and having order and having a system to be able to fight and defeat the British. Which terms accurately describe winter at Valley Forge? There are 3 little icons, so you will pick 3 terms. Go ahead and pause the video and make your selection. Excellent. The correct answer, transformative, cold, and challenging. The reason it is transformative is because it's when Washington's army goes from being a disorganized militia to an actual prepared army. It was cold, it was the winter, it was snowy. Remember, a lot of the men got frostbite, and it was very challenging. It is not an easy thing to create a prepared army, especially in the dead of winter. So before, Washington's army is a disorganized militia. What happens after winter at Valley Forge? So think of this as like a before and after side by side. Go ahead and pause the video and select your response. So the correct answer for this one, before winter at Valley Forge, Washington's army is a disorganized militia. After winter at Valley Forge, Washington's army is organized and more powerful. Key point 5. The Revolutionary War ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1793. This treaty gave the colonies independence from Great Britain and boundaries extended to Canada to the north, the Mississippi River to the west, and Florida to the south. So both groups, the colonists and the British, decided to stop fighting, and they both signed the Treaty of Paris. We know that a treaty is just an agreement. So both groups signed this agreement, this Treaty of Paris, to say the war is over and the colonists, the American colonists, have won. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, the United States, which is green on your map, gets more land. I know you're thinking, the Spanish have a lot of land. Yes, in this time period, the Spanish had colonized most of the Western United States and almost all of Central America. That will change as we move on in history. But at this time period, all the land that British subjects, so those American colonists we've been talking about, all the land that they've lived on is this green, and it is now their land. The British still have Canada, as you can see, and they share it a little bit with the Spanish over here. And then Northern Canada is the indigenous people. So the colonists are free from Great Britain's control. So at this point in history, the colonies are no longer attached to Great Britain. They do not have to listen to King George. He has lost the war. He has signed the treaty. It is done and over. The blank ended the Revolutionary War and gave the colonies independence from Great Britain. Go ahead and pick which document that was. Pause the video and select your response. So the correct answer for this one, the Treaty of Paris in 1793 ended the Revolutionary War and gave the colonies independence from Great Britain. Last MRS of the day. Which statement is true at this point in history? Go ahead and pause the video and select your response. All right, the correct answer for this one, the colonies are independent from Great Britain and have acquired or gotten more land by the Treaty of Paris. So at this point, we have finished our lesson for today. I'm going to bring us back to our learning objective. I will be able to summarize key milestones during the Revolutionary War.